Напускането и намирането са две страни на една и съща история. Пътешествието ми е едновременно загуба и откритие. Намерих се тук, за да остана там. Споделете пътя на писателя-мигрант на Столица литература, писане за имиграцията, на 12, 17, 18 и 19 юни. Повече за събитието научете на ekf.bg.
My name is Untitled. I work here at the Department of English and American Studies at Sophieski University. And it's a tradition of our department to invite every year the tutors from the Suzuki fiction seminars organized by the Elizabet Foundation for a talk on creative writing. So our next speaker is Kristoфър Кастелани. Welcome. And once again, Milena Deleva.
Hello, I'm here mirroring Untitled, Milena Deleva of Elizabet Kostova Foundation. For those who just arrived, that's the second creative writing lecture from our annual Capital Literature program, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Kristoфър Кастелани, who is our distinguished guest lecturer in Suzopo, and he is the author of 4 novels in English. His most recent novel, Living Men, he has won the Guggenheim Fellowship Award, and it was published by Viking Penguin in February 2019, so it's brand new, and actually he's gonna read from that novel.
Oh, I'm reading from that too.
Sorry?
I didn't know I was doing the reading from that too.
Oh, if you have time, maybe.
Yes, sure.
It's a very brief excerpt.
I don't know if I have it. That's the only problem.
Oh, maybe I have
You
it,
probably have it. Okay.
Yes, I have.
Sorry.
Okay, he has also the author of the novels All This Talk of Love, The Saint of Lost Things, and A Kiss from Madalena. And he won the Massachusetts Book Award of this novel. Kristoфър taught in the MFA program at Warren Wilson at the Brett Loaf Writers Conference. And currently he is also the artistic director of one of the biggest independent creative writing centers, Crop Street in Boston, US. With that said, I'll pass the floor to Kristoфър, and then the same procedure. Hopefully we'll have time for questions. If not, there will be round table starting at 7 p.m. in Toronto, and Kristoфър will be also on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to Milena for inviting me, to the Kostova Foundation for inviting me. I'm very happy to speak with you this evening. So I have a lecture that the topic of the fiction seminars for the lectures this year was writing immigration, and so that is the topic I was given, and this is my own somewhat personal. There's a little bit of my own personal family story in there, a little bit of my own feelings about immigrant literature, a little bit about technique, craft, point of view in fiction, but it is all my own. It is not meant to be comprehensive, like the only story about this topic, because it's a very big topic. So I'm going to lecture for about 30 minutes, I think. It's about how long it should take, and then I'm happy to and the title is Riding the Hyphen. There are only 2 possible stories, goes the old adage, frequently attributed to John Gardner. A man goes on a journey, or a stranger comes to town. It's the sort of thing I've said casually to my students over the years as a way to help them organize their ideas. But it strikes me now that every immigrant story I know of falls into one, or in most cases both, of those archetypes. A character leaves behind a place, a life really, a home, a language, a personhood, to embark on a personal quest. Or a character enters an unfamiliar country where he is a stranger to most, and finds he must navigate its codes and culture in order to survive. The leaving behind is as much a theme in these stories as is the navigation, and the adventure is as much a loss as it is a journey of discoveries. Embedded in all the tropes of immigrant literature, then, are these classic elements of storytelling, elements that get at the heart of identity. For this reason alone, it should surprise no one that immigrant literature is so rich and varied and compelling and satisfying, even to readers who have never left their hometown. In the New York Times, Parul Sagal wrote, "Aren't the themes of immigrant literature, estrangement, homelessness, fractured identities, the stuff of all modern literature, if not life?" Seen through this lens, that's the end of the quote. Seen through this lens, we might even consider The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's journey from black and white to color and then back again, as an immigrant story. Maybe even Alice in Wonderland or Gulliver's Travels. Dorothy, Alice, and Gulliver are all on journeys, and they all find themselves strangers who come to town. They're all stories of dislocation, of a kind of restlessness, and hand in hand with loneliness. All stories in which a character must grapple with that most essential question, how do I live? Or, to be more precise, how do I live here? I'm not implying here that all stories are immigrant stories, but that all immigrant stories, all these tales of departure and arrival, wrestle with universal and therefore relatable questions. Just as there is no arrival without departure in these stories, there is no departure without the specter of return. This could mean return to the homeland, to the origin, to the place where identity is coherent or at least stable. It could also mean returning to the barely known place where one began and seeing it as if for the first time. For some immigrants in both fiction and nonfiction, return is filled with very real terror. Threats of persecution, imprisonment, or unspeakable violence. For others, return is a beautiful, lifelong, longed-for dream. It holds the potential for the closing of the circle of life, for happy reunions, for a reclamation of a simpler past, or for a reckoning with a place and a people that could not be understood without having left them behind. For most, return is something in between terror and peace, something vexed at best, and it's this in-betweenness, this vexedness, that has always interested me most in immigrant literature, and which seems best suited to the literary writer, the ambivalence of home, its overdetermination and contradictions, the guilt and tension and mystery of it. Though I'm not an immigrant myself, I am the son of Italian immigrants and have published 3 novels inspired by my parents' experiences growing up in Italy in the 1930s, migrating to the United States after World War II, and navigating their tensions with first-generation children. These novels have been shelved in bookstores as immigrant literature, a category that has itself, especially recently, become contentious. To some critics, the category both presupposes and reinforces a myth that a person travels from one culturally monolithic place, a homeland like Italy, to another culturally monolithic place, a new world, say United States, with their culturally monolithic identity, say Italianness, strapped to their backs. It tends to forget or minimize the fact that the Italian comes from many bloodlines and classes and regions, that New York is a very different place from Kansas, that Italianness is a construct, and a murky one at that, and that people's reasons for choosing one home over another are as varied and contradictory as the people themselves. One of the many challenges of the category of immigrant literature is that the books that fit this description are too often viewed as historical documents of, say, the Italian-American experience, writ large, rather than as nuanced individual histories, as unique and unrepeatable as the people who wrote them. When we read these books, we have an unfortunate, if forgivable, tendency to group them by nationality or ethnicity or itinerary, and to zoom in on commonalities and cultural truisms across them, and then to make broad generalizations about those commonalities and truisms. This flattens out such books and stories, of course, and makes consuming them seem almost utilitarian or part of a process of self-edification. So a reader might say, I read Zadie Smith to understand the multi-ethnic world of contemporary London, Or China is in the news, therefore I should read The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. But I don't believe that literature is best consumed for these utilitarian or self-edifying reasons. I believe we read literature to slow down our lives, not escape from them, or to learn something about someone else. And I believe we write fiction not to figure out the human condition or to solve the questions of why we make the choices we make, but to make those choices and journeys more complicated, more nuanced, and not flat. This necessarily begs the question of audience, which is the question most writers of immigrant literature struggle with, and for which there is again no right or clear answer. For whom is my story written, we ask ourselves, plagued by the demands of both our own artistic vision, our muse, and the commercial demands of publishing, the marketplace. The muse asks, am I writing for the person person outside my culture, the one who is reading my book to learn something? Or am I writing for the person within my culture, who is reading for insight into our shared experience and to be seen? Identifying and then settling on this hypothetical audience helps answer further major and seemingly minor questions, though it never fully resolves them. Questions like, how much history do I have to explain or contextualize? In what language should I tell it? Do I put the foreign words in italics? For example, if I'm an Iranian American telling the story of an Iranian who flees that country in the 1970s and emigrates to Boston, don't I limit myself if my audience is Westerners with limited knowledge of anything but their own country's histories? Don't I want to write for my people back in Iran in our own language to illuminate for them the strangeness of Boston, to treat Boston like as the culture and history that must be contextualized and explained? But what if that language or that history is as foreign to me as it is to the average Westerner? Do I still have the right to tell it just because I have Iranian blood? Mostly what we writers end up doing when it comes to these questions of audience is choosing the all of the above option, trying with varying degrees of success to have it both ways, to appeal to every possible reader, even when we aren't consciously trying to do so. This blurs our focus and dilutes the impact of the story in the process. In this sense, our books belong fully to neither culture. They occupy that middle ground, that new space, our unique identity and our unique perspective and our divided loyalties and our limited knowledge and experience has created, the one that belongs to us and us alone. I call this riding the hyphen, the straddling of that little black line between Italian, American, Russian, German, or pick your identity, right? To me, the most exciting demand of immigrant literature is to see the hyphen not as a bridge between two easily recognizable and digestible identities, but as the rope in a tug of war. In my own work, I have tried to document that tug of war, all that pulling and falling and sliding into the mud, by locating it in the most charged and personal context of all, the family. My parents' true point of departure from their homeland was not a port town, but a home. They did not leave Italy on a ship from Naples. They left Italy the moment they untangled themselves from the arms of their mothers in the thresholds of the stone houses of Sant'Elpidio, the tiny village in which they were both born and where they expected to spend their entirety of their lives. My parents did not flee hardship. I lost my place. My parents did not flee hardship. They fled predictability, tradition, and security. In doing so, they fled their families, the primary source of their identities, which meant abandoning themselves and all of the future selves that they had been imagining for as long as they had been alive. This abandonment caused immeasurable heartache and fear, and it's important to emphasize that not even this fear or lack of certainty of survival was enough to stop them from leaving. Such is the inexorable and fierce pull and drive of the immigrant, that when leaving behind stability and security for the promise of a better place, she will also leave behind reason. A character must want and want intensely, goes another old adage of the writing workshop, this one attributed to Janet Burroway. There is no story without desire, and without an obstacle to that desire. Here again, a classic element of storytelling is embedded in the trope of immigrant literature, that unstoppable, improbable desire, the one that launches the character into an adventure without the benefit of reason or security. This desire is particularly potent, of course, when the immigrant is leaving behind not security or stability, but persecution or poverty. Then it becomes less a desire than a demand of a life force, an innate instinct to survive. And from this instinct, great stories are born. First, the desire or instinct to leave, and then from my own mother at least, the desire just as unceasing, just as powerful to go back, to undo everything. For as long as I can remember, my mother told me over and over again of spending every Sunday afternoon in the 1950s listening to the one Italian radio program that was broadcast in the United States, desperate for the connection to home that those voices and songs brought to her. She was 19, married to an older man she barely knew and didn't love, living in a cramped row house with his large family of strangers. My entire life I've understood my mother through the lens of that one story of the radio, specifically the tableau of her sitting beside it every Sunday afternoon like a doomed princess in a fairy tale. For me, it represented her constant longing for her lost world, of course, her deep sadness, her sense of dislocation. What's remarkable to me is that this one story came to define her in my eyes. I couldn't see her any other way than as that doomed princess. What's even more remarkable to me is that over the years, her story came to feel like my own memory, my own experience. I can't tell you for sure that it wasn't me at that radio in 1954, pressing my ear against the soft cloth to feel its vibrations. Brain science actually backs up this kind of radical identification. Recent research has shown that a story that is powerfully told in any form, in literature, film, stage, actually tricks our brains into experiencing it as real life, as our own experience. The brain networks used to consume and understand the process and stories are the same networks used to interact with people in the real world. In other words, stories don't just entertain us, they define us, and they refine us. As such, they are generators of empathy, forcing us to walk mile after mile in the shoes of others. Everyone in this room grew up on a steady diet of these stories. Stories about our parents, about our families, about the childhoods that we've forgotten, about our neighborhoods and our countries. And it's those stories, as much, if not more, than what we actually experienced and remembered, that have shaped our identity, our worldview, and our values. I would argue that we base our decisions, including our votes, more on the stories that we've internalized than the facts that we read in the newspaper. Perhaps this is why facts have become less compelling lately. The stories we consume on the news that is often skewed to reinforce a single narrative, are infinitely more convincing to us than statistics, reason, theory, and even the precedents of history. This is true certainly in the United States. We can stare a fact in the face and say, no, that is not consistent with my experience, therefore I don't believe it. Forgetting for a crucial moment that it wasn't our experience at all. It was a story that we read or saw or that was told to us by someone that we trusted. I can't think of a single country that isn't currently facing a crisis of immigration of some sort. Everywhere we look, people are asking themselves, who are these people who want to come live with me? And why should I care about them? The more immigrant stories there are in the world, the more stories of cultural negotiation and adaptation and preservation, of resistance and assimilation, and the more authentically they reflect and illuminate the complex intersectionality of race and gender and class and sexual identity, the more we will all feel like immigrants, complete with our own desires to leave, to explore, and perhaps even to return. And then I hope the better informed we will be about our decisions, our votes, and the stories that we tell others. By now, we're likely all familiar with the danger of the single story, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's generation-defining talk on this very issue. Adichie reminds us that the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. She argues in a way that is both obvious and profound that when a particular group, a nation, a culture, any group linked by identity is shown as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, then that is what they become. It is an argument not only for a multiplicity of stories about the immigrant experience, but as I suggested earlier, to bring freshness and depth not only to the hyphen itself, but the cultures on both sides of it. In other words, to write books and stories that avoid monolithic portrayals of the homeland or the new world. I take these words as a call to action. Though she doesn't explicitly make such a call, this is what Adichie says to me as a reader: be extravagant and promiscuous in your choice of stories set in other countries or which represent cultures and experiences different from your own. Seek a wide range within each country or group, and don't allow yourself to be convinced of any group's essential ethos. This is what Adichie's speech says to me as a writer. You have a moral obligation to your characters. If your Italian-American character reinforces a stereotype, or your fictional Italian-American family acts like every other fictional Italian-American family, you are guilty of perpetuating a single story. You are part of the problem. If we take it as a given that stories exert power, that they affect change in the world in immeasurable ways, then it follows that who tells the story occupies the most powerful position of all. I have written widely on narration and the role of the storyteller in my book, The Art of Perspective, but until this talk, I haven't focused on the implications for the storyteller on the hyphen. When I say the storyteller on the hyphen, I mean both the writer herself and, in fiction, the character or the consciousness she chooses as the narrator. Both are in positions of power, but I would argue the greater power and the greater reach and the greater responsibility belongs actually to the narrator, and so it's on the role of the narrator in immigrant fiction specifically that I want to focus now for a little bit. So let me skip ahead a little bit. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. In Granta, in an essay about Günter Grass, Salman Rushdie wrote, "A full migrant suffers traditionally a triple disruption. He loses his place, he enters into an alien language, and he finds himself surrounded by beings whose social behavior and code is very unlike and sometimes even offensive to his own. And this is what makes migrants such important figures, because roots, language, and social norms have been three of the most important parts of the definition of what it is to be a human being. The migrant, denied all three of these, is obliged to find new ways of describing himself, new ways of being human." And I argued earlier that writing in first person versus third person and focusing that on the narrator lends an extra kind of power to these types of stories. Because readers demand more from first-person narrators, especially those who are obliged to find those new ways of describing themselves, those new ways of being human, and especially any who dare to reveal how awful they are. We demand more humor, more style, more insight from first person. If these narrators are going to keep barking in our ear, they better do it with some grace and ambition, and they better have something important to say. We want to trust these narrators, but more than that, we want them to be in complete control of the story. Otherwise, they lose our respect. Because of this, immigrant writers and narrators whose very identity and humanity is in the process of being defined are subject to even closer scrutiny. The immigrant novel has tended to be optimistic by nature, says Parul Segal in the New York Times. Stories of upward mobility tinged with nostalgia for the motherland and animated by the character's struggle to balance individual desires and the demands of the family or community. As a way of further discussing the importance of first-person narration on immigrant writing, I want to look at this one particular book called Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih. Does anyone know this book? It's a wonderful book. Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih. It's decidedly not optimistic as an immigrant story. So it challenges our assumptions and expectations about the immigrant experience. So early in this novel, it has two narrators, and one of them is named Mustafa Saeed, and he says to the other narrator, "I shall say things to you I've said to no one else before. I found no reason for doing so until now. I've decided to do so unless your imagination runs away with you, since you have studied poetry." The other narrator, who is the poetry student and never gets a name, he's come back many years, he's come back to the Sudan many years after studying at a British university. And this unnamed poetry student, who I'll call the scholar, is the narrator of most of the novel in first person. But it's Saeed's story, this other story, which is also told in first person, which constantly interrupts the scholar's story in three different sections. And you almost think that Saeed narrates the entire book because his narration is so memorable. Saeed is immediately a figure of fascination and mystery for the scholar and for the reader. Like the scholar, Saeed has left home to study in Great Britain, and instead of making his life there as an immigrant, he comes back to his native country. One of the many anxieties that pulse through this extraordinary post-colonial novel is what use, if any, Western education is to either man and to their newly liberated homeland. Or at least, how can they use whatever wisdom or knowledge or social capital they got from their time as a migrant in the West to build and rebuild their home country of Sudan? It's a similar question with slightly different resonance that the two young lovers in Adichie's Americana, both of whom have studied in the West, ask about their homeland of Nigeria at the end of that novel. The scholar in Season of Migration to the North has taken a civil service job, but he is ineffectual and indecisive in his role. He displays little courage to defend or act on his opinions. His education has not prepared him for the political and cultural decisions he must make in his own country. In the years that the scholar flounders in Sudan, Saeed, the other narrator, dies, and entrusts the scholar not only with his story, but with the care of his wife and sons. Tragically, though, the scholar is incapable of succeeding in that role either. By any and all measures, the scholar is undoubtedly the better man of these two men, maybe even the moral center of the book, but his story is one of passivity and paralysis, while Saeed's story is one of action. Saeed is actually a monster. He terrorizes women. In Britain, he drives 3 of them to suicide. He exploits his otherness to seduce them. He murders his wife, Jean Morris. But ultimately, it's not the scholar, but Saeed, the monster, who is the most compelling to the reader, and whose immigrant story is the one that stays with us. It's not just because the scholar is passive and ineffectual, it's because he's not as good of a storyteller. So what makes Saeed's first-person story more effective than the scholar's story? They're both in first person. One difference is that Saeed's narration uses poetic images, rhythms, and patterns, and haunting repetition, in particular, to powerful and dramatic effect. He has this high style, honed in the West, that distinguishes his voice from the scholar's. Saeed is also in complete and conscious control of language itself, in his timing, his metaphors, his use of sensory descriptions, reveling in the colonizer's tongue and the colonizer's literature to advance his desires. which are a passionate mix of sexual, intellectual, and political. So I wanted to share a little bit about that book just because I wanted to point out an immigrant story that is about how immigrant stories are not enough, right? And it's about how you can take the stereotypes of immigrant stories and turn them into something else and actually have it be a political comment on immigrant stories. I love books that take something that you know and turn it the other way and force you to look at it in a different way. So this is the end. When I was in elementary school, both my parents worked full-time and full-time working class jobs. My father in the shipping department of a commercial bakery, my mother as a seamstress. And in the afternoons, I was put into the care of a neglectful teenager down the street. She would talk on the phone or entertain her many boyfriends, while in an empty room upstairs, I watched anxiously from the window for our family car, increasingly panicked that it would never arrive, that something terrible had happened to my mother and father, that something that would keep them from me forever. This panic would crescendo as 6 o'clock neared, and I imagined the inevitability of my life without them. I'm convinced now that my life as an immigrant writer began there, in the upstairs window of that babysitter's house. Not the physical act of putting words on paper, of course, but the loneliness and the longing necessary to do so, to preserve time in narrative, to record voices and stories in order to keep them close and to protect them. Somehow, even then, I sensed that the only way to conquer time, to have some mastery over time, at least, however illusory that mastery would turn out to be, was through storytelling. Looking back in this way, I can't help but see the parallel between my mother listening at the radio for some connection to her lost world, and me with my face pressed to the babysitter's window, praying that the only world I knew wouldn't be lost the way that hers was. My parents were riding their own hyphen, a part of them in a far-off place, and another part of them in mine. They were mine, but they never fully belonged to me. The part of them in that far-off place was and will forever be unknowable to me, speaking in a language I can't understand. I can't help thinking that every child of immigrants is born into this sort of loss, that loss itself is encoded in our genes, that every immigrant story is an elegy. Because the child of immigrants knows loss as a condition of life, we come to expect it. And because we sense that loss is imminent, we tend to cling as fiercely as possible to the stories we grew up with. All Americans have something lonely about them, writes Ryu Murakami in his novel In the Miso Soup. I don't know what the reason might be, except that they're all descended from immigrants. According to Haitian-American author Edwidge Danticat, the idea of this great anguish of living between two worlds has diminished somewhat for many immigrant people, artists, and non-artists alike. Not that there's not some uneasiness, but it is no longer the single most urgent anxiety of every immigrant's life. I would like us to move beyond, this is still Danticat, I would like us to move beyond these tropes of speaking to or for, and of being only between two worlds. We are at the same time speaking to no one and to everyone. End of quote. Danticat is right, of course, that the hyphen is not necessarily the source of the single most urgent anxiety of every immigrant's life. For all of us, our relationship to the hyphen is one of degree, and it is often superseded by very real threats to our existence in the places we live. But when there is an urgent anxiety in our work, when there is a question of audience or of authentic voice, or of writing for social change, or of the political ramifications of a particular piece of art, then it is on the hyphen that every reader and critic must inevitably focuses. As artists, we are judged by how successfully we have negotiated and interpreted the hyphen, the freshness and the depth that we've brought to it, the stereotypes we've either reinforced or turned upside down. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I feel like I should clarify something for you and for the audience. That we didn't invite you because your name is of Italian origin. We actually, I think we invited you before we decided on the team. And personally, as a reader, for me, fictional authority is formed not by who is writing the story, but how the story has been told.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. No, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't know which came first, me or the theme.
I think you came first. So I think we have time for questions.
Sure. Happy to answer. Sure, yes.
That's very interesting, thank you very much. And it was actually addressing the question that was always a problem for me with regard to immigrant literature or nomadic literature or whatever way to call this you choose. And this is, if we're so aware that it is a trope, and this is very much a literary trope, that difference, otherness, impossibility to find any kind of identity is the very essence of literature. Why then we need this trope if it is so much, so imminent, so internally, innately valid for any literary experience, if it is a genuine aesthetic literary experience? So yeah, that's my question.
I think actually, I have two answers. One is bookstores like to know where to put the book on the shelf, right? So with that we need, we are always doing this to all kinds of art, right? We're deciding, oh, it's this category, it's that category, it's this category, and we reduce and reduce and reduce so that we know how to find it, how to classify it, how to study it, how we look for patterns, we look for comparisons within that particular that particular category, right? So I think it's just in some ways a practical reason, that we have this need to categorize something as immigrant literature. But I also, as I mentioned a little bit, that it speaks to our need to our kind of, so there's the practical reason to classify things, but then there's a kind of internal impulse to break things down and to resist in a way the messiness, like we like things to be this or that. We like things to be Italian American or this or that, and in order to process them, to feel like we have some control over them, and so it's partly our own kind of need to kind of reduce things, I think, but I'm not sure if that gets fully at your question.
Not fully. Because one of the important dangers here is that will give a kind of too connected with space, spatial attitude to types of difference or otherness that do not have, do not possess a spatial aspect or manifestation.
But we also can't deny that space does exert a kind of pressure or kind of it's that where people come from and what particular moment in history they come from does define their character, right? And so defines who they are. And looking at that experience, is what's most interesting. But it gets back a little too to what I was saying, that what I don't like, and maybe this is what you're saying, is that we look at let's say the story of the Bulgarian who moves to the UK, right? That there's a story about that a novel that comes out about that, and then suddenly it's not one Bulgarian's experience. It stands for all of Bulgarian's experience, all of Bulgarian man's experience, and that's what I was trying to say. But the more Bulgarian stories that come out of moving from Bulgaria to the UK or moving of Bulgaria to the US, the more of those stories that come out, the less we start to see it as, one kind of story, and the more we start to see, oh, it's that story is different from that story, is different from that story, it's just another story, right? It's just another unique individual history, rather than the history of a time and a place. Is that, yeah, that gets that, yeah. But again, the brain, we need to make patterns. Like, that's what the brain wants to do. The brain wants to classify. You know, it wants to say.
That contradicts your main point, that we should not simplify, that we should somehow go. These patterns.
No, I'm saying we need to go against our brains, you know, our impulse to do that, you know. That is exactly the opposite. Yeah. So this is set in. They spend a lot of time in Italy together. The happiest sort of times of their lives were spent in Italy in the 50s and 60s, and the only thing this is the very beginning of the book. So the only thing you need to know is that Williams had a nickname for Frank, which was the Little Horse. He called him the Little Horse because he was rather short, and he had kind of like a horse-like body, and so that was his name for him. And and this is just, I think, 5 minutes. Truman was throwing a party in Portofino, and Frank wanted to go. The invitation came in mid-July, slipped between parentheses in the long, gossipy paragraphs of his letter to Ten, as if daring him to acknowledge it. Frank read the letter in Ten's absence. He'd been stuck for weeks in their stuffy 4th-floor apartment on Via Firenze, waiting for him to get back from Spain, while on the loud streets below, the real Romans were escaping for the mountains. He replied to Truman with a brief telegram, and then he called the finest hotel in town, the Splendido, to book a room. He auditioned various linen jackets and swim trunks and hats in the mirror above the dresser, mended 2 pairs of Ten's socks, and walked their silks down to the cleaners. When Ten returned home to find their bags lined up in the hall, packed for another trip, he didn't protest. He was sweet on Frank again, after 3 weeks apart. A drive in the Jag, up the coast of Liguria, far from the melting heart of the Centro, could only make things sweeter. They left the next day for Portofino. Truman had rented an apartment a few steps from the harbor, above the Delfino restaurant, which Frank and Ten passed on their way up the hill to the Splendido. Ten paid the boat guy to carry their luggage, and when the hill got too steep, Frank grabbed the heavy case with the typewriter. He didn't like it when another guy did work for him that he could do himself, a guy that would have been him if he had never left Jersey. Ten went straight to the desk as usual, and Frank arranged their dress shirts on hangers and brought their shoes down for shining and stole another hour for a nap. He had never felt so tired in the middle of the afternoon, and he chalked it up to being 30. But it's possible, no doctor was ever able to tell him for sure, one way or the other, that the trouble had already started in his lungs. When he woke up, Ten offered him a pill. Ten had as many pills as Italy had houses on the water. But Frank wasn't taking pills, not then. Instead, he smoked another cigarette and paid the boat guy to drive him over the mountain to Paragi Beach, where he swam to find his strength and clear his head. They didn't like Truman much, but Frank didn't hate him the way Ten did, or maybe Ten didn't hate Truman. It was hard to know for sure with Ten. It was a job in itself keeping track of who he was angry with and who was jealous of him, whose parties he was looking forward to, and whose they'd have to make up some excuse to get out of. Frank's official job was as Ten's secretary, but even his secretary didn't have a reason for being in Portofino other than to stop by Truman's party, and he didn't know when they'd be leaving. There wasn't much Frank knew in the summer of 1953, least of all how long he and Ten might last. At the Delfino, Frank lost track of him the first minute. Ten couldn't walk into a room without someone sweeping him up and into a crowd. How many times had Frank stood at the edge of the crowd as if on a shore, watching him drift farther and farther out, his head bobbing on the waves, glancing back just once to meet his eyes? How many times had Frank found himself in an overflowing room like this one, greeting guests as they arrive, recognizing their faces from movies and the backstages of theaters. How many times had these people walked in, looked around, saw Frank, saw nobody, spotted a somebody over his shoulder, and then headed upstairs? In those years, there was no such thing as early, late, or on time. They went from place to place on a magic carpet, dropped here, dropped there, women in electric dresses, men in monkey suits and bow ties made of white silk, cognac, cigars, wine. The sky turquoise even when it was gray. Because Ten had no mind and little use for schedules and logistics and coordinates, he needed Frank to organize the day they woke up to and the coming days and even the days before. The life of Tennessee Williams was a memory play in which memory was a jumble. It was bodies that he remembered, bodies that they remembered together, his body and Frank's, the Southern gentleman and the little horse. When it came to matters of the body, Frank and Ten trusted each other like soldiers.